I just want to talk about the value of suffering, or what suffering is, because I think a lot of people encounter suffering in the wrong way, where, okay, something bad has happened. Maybe you have, kids that ended up on drugs or something like that, or something in that area of pain in life, right? And what I found is that in order to avoid great suffering, you have to encounter great suffering. So the good news is that there's probably a way out of getting your kids to end up in going in the wrong direction, or whatever it is you're trying to avoid. You probably can't avoid it. The bad news is it's going to be just as painful, but for the right reason. And when I was younger, I always used to wonder, okay, I was inspired at least by the idea of character. I wanted to have character for a while, and what I heard was character is what you do when no one else is around. Can you do your homework? Can you put in the work? Can you run sprints by yourself? Can you engage in that? And then as I got older, I started to ask myself recently, what is it when none of the inspiration is around, when none of the hope is around, when none of the good emotions are around, and you're still putting in work? What is that? And I think it's a step beyond character, and I think what you call it is suffering. And ultimately, suffering isn't like an exciting word as in compared to character. I'd rather have character than suffering, honestly, but I think suffering contributes to the most important thing. And so usually whenever you reach, and I mean, just look at Jesus, when he was in the desert for 40 days, right? I'm sure he wasn't inspired. He was doing something that was probably what you would call suffering. And but ultimately the idea is that at the end of the dryness and the lack of motivation and the lack of inspiration, and ultimately at the very end of it, he was tempted, right? So if you find yourself in a situation where it's very dry, you're not very motivated, your environment's pretty much dead, everything around you is dead, but you're pretty much just suffering and continuing in the right direction, and at the end of it, and when you're most tired, probably, you find yourself tempted. What I'd like to say is that if you can make it through that, angels will minister to you. Not necessarily angels, but that's what happened to Jesus, right? So in my life, I've always found that if you want to find meaning, you can't just think it up in your head. You have to experience some sort of suffering, and then you can make meaning of your life from that. And motivation psychologically doesn't come from your head. It actually comes from the inertia of action. So your motivation comes from what you do. In Sirach, a part of the Bible, I believe it says the expression of a thought discloses the cultivation of a man's mind. So essentially, wisdom comes from experience and what you do. And like cultivation, that's not easy either. So, but how can it be that that suffering is valuable? Because that was just a question I had. Like, how can that be? Because ultimately, not being inspired and putting in work, or moving in a certain area and continuing, and it might be monotonous, it might be painful at that point. What you're doing when none of the good feelings are around, that's suffering. So I was like, what is that, and how valuable is that? And I realized that's how you manifest your value. But I heard with regards to angels that if they could be jealous of us, they'd be jealous of our suffering. Because when we suffer, we're sharing in the passion of Christ. And if you know anything about Christ, he came here to die for us, right? So his death was ultimately how he manifested his value. It was him manifesting his purpose, was to die for everybody. So if you're telling me that when you're suffering, you're partaking in that, maybe then when you're suffering, you're manifesting your value. for me, I didn't have a lot of self-esteem, and so I actually enjoyed suffering. I don't want to talk about how you can maybe change your mindset and enjoy suffering. So suffering, not an exciting term until you come to the realization that you're nothing. And I think you can hold more, like I said in a previous video, you can hold more when you realize your nothingness. And the ocean holds the most water because it lies the lowest, lower than any other river, lake, and stream. And so what I'm saying is this: when you realize your nothingness, which I had at one point in my life, I was kind of, I don't want to go into the details, but I was kind of there, and I realized my nothingness. It was at that moment that I also found that I had fallen in love. And what do you give when you're nothing? And the reason I ask, what do you give when you're nothing, is because love you can only have by giving. So if you really are in love, you'll realize love is only had by giving. And what do you give when you're nothing? And ultimately, that's your suffering. You suffer for the person you love, and you suffer for the people you love. And I believe if you don't know great suffering, you don't know great love, because love is never without suffering. So maybe you see that, okay, you manifest your value when you suffer. Maybe you see that, okay, suffering is the manifestation. That's the part of the process of love, and that needs to take place to be in love. Okay, so maybe suffering is the most valuable thing I can do. Maybe that's a result of love, right? The ability to suffer for the right reason is something from love. So there's those two things, but there's one other thing. There's a third thing that I want to talk about, and for me, that was where your greatest comforts come from. I believe your greatest comforts come from your greatest afflictions, because the truth only comforts the afflicted. And so that's where I found my prayer. That's where I found my God. That's where I found ultimately what I'm talking about when I'm talking about suffering is how I found God. Because ultimately, when you put in the work, if you can work greatly, I guarantee you can rest greatly. And rest is a synonym for prayer. So you better believe I was a good prayer person. I didn't know it at the time, and I just figured that out, that prayer is actually a translation for rest. In the Bible, it's like a Greek translation. So I was always putting in a lot of work, or maybe suffering or whatever, and that's how I found God. It was through those moments when I would go to church and I would rest in there and I would listen to what he had to say. And I was in my greatest afflictions, but that's also where I found my greatest comforts. So suffering can allow you to do that, find your greatest peace, and find your greatest joy. And happiness today is cheap, because people circumstantially become happy with the things around them. Their sports team makes them happy, but just as easily they can make them upset. So don't let your happiness be so cheap you can lose it over little things, but find value in suffering, because in that suffering it only makes you want to suffer more. And that suffering that you do ultimately end up encountering gives you your greatest comforts, gives you your greatest prayers, and gives you your greatest peace.